In a world of shattered spires and forgotten glories, where kingdoms had crumbled to dust under the heel of bio-guilds, power was a thing of flesh and blasphemy. It was a world bleeding mana, not as a river of life, but as a corrupted torrent, a poisoned deluge fouled by the ambitions of forbidden science. Here, sorcerers were little more than folklore, obsolete relics of a bygone age. The new gods were the biomancers, living chimeras who rewrote their own genetic code as if it were scripture, unleashing monstrous transformations and aberrations that spat upon the very laws of nature. Society itself had become a grand, grotesque experiment, a dominion built on secrets soaked in blood, enslaved by the architects of bioengineering who saw life as mere clay to be molded. And in the sterile, frozen heart of a hidden laboratory, deep within the planet's crust, a secret was given a name: Kairos. He was a prototype, a desperate gamble forged in the crucible of hubris, a living key designed to break the chains of mortality. But the power coursing through his veins was a wildfire sealed in a fragile vial, his mutations as unpredictable as they were magnificent. And so his creators, with the cold, dispassionate finality of a god judging its own flawed creation, branded him a failure. Deep in the abyssal levels of the Institute, where light was a forgotten memory, he was left to rot. Existence became a clinical cycle of pain, a symphony of humming machinery and sterile fluid that served as both his cradle and his cage. Translucent tubes, like parasitic vines, snaked into his flesh, feeding him, breathing for him, sustaining the fragile, unstable biocore that was his original sin. Each day was a meticulous lesson in dehumanization. His identity was stripped away by endless, agonizing tests and a soul-crushing neglect that was more violent than any blade. His trust in others had been surgically excised, leaving behind a cold, tactical intellect and a dormant, simmering rage that coiled in the depths of his being. He was a ghost in his own body, a living abomination whose spirit, against all logic, refused to break. It simply hardened, calcifying under the immense pressure, waiting for the spark that would ignite the inferno and allow him to reclaim the dignity stolen from his very genesis. That spark was not a promise of freedom, but a sentence of death. The architects of his suffering, the faceless Directorate who presided over this world from their chrome towers, decided to wipe the slate clean. A purge was initiated, a devastating, silent chain reaction designed to obliterate all their failures, to erase the evidence of their arrogance from the pages of history. An invisible wave of annihilation, a ripple of pure entropy, swept through the dark recesses of the laboratory. It was a silent, efficient plague that unmade flesh and bone, that turned screams to static and life to dust. As this wave of erasure washed over Kairos, a strange, profound peace settled over him. This was the end, he thought, the final data point in a failed experiment. The machinery tethering him to life shrieked a final metallic protest before falling silent. The rhythmic pulse that had been the soundtrack to his entire existence was gone. But in the sudden, deafening silence, something deep within him, something primordial, answered the call of oblivion, not with submission, but with roaring defiance. His unstable biocore, the very source of his weakness, the flaw that had condemned him, did not implode. It detonated. A silent, blinding explosion of pure life force ripped through his being, a nova of creation in the heart of annihilation. It was not death, but a harrowing, agonizing rebirth. The core had fused with something ancient, something that had pulsed dormant within his DNA since the moment of his conception. A forbidden, organic Godseed. The cataclysmic transformation didn't just shatter the laboratory, it vaporized it, carving a raw, gaping crater into the earth where a mountain once stood. The Directorate's wave of annihilation was consumed, reversed, devoured by a power it could not comprehend. From the epicenter of the blast, where the air still crackled with impossible energies, Kairos rose. He was no longer shackled to machines, no longer a fragile prototype trembling in a sterile tank. The raw, untamed power that had once branded him a failure now poured from him in a monstrous, earth-shattering crescendo that announced his arrival to a world that did not know his name. He was not a discarded experiment. He was an immortal biological deity, reborn from the ashes of human arrogance. And his first breath of true freedom was a silent, resonant declaration of war against his creators. His body felt alien, a vessel of impossible energy that thrummed with the music of creation. The world, once a muted view through reinforced glass, now assaulted his senses with a clarity that was both breathtakingly beautiful and terrifying. He could feel the life force of the very microbes in the dust swirling around him, the faint, corrupted pulse of mana deep within the planet's wounded core. A system had awakened within his DNA, an intuitive, living lattice of information, the Godseed itself. It was an entity that manipulated the laws of biology at a cellular level, a silent consciousness that saw the universe as a sequence to be rewritten. It granted him a horrifying immortality, a regenerative omnipotence that treated fatal wounds as minor inconveniences. Entropy itself seemed to bend around him, a reluctant servant to his will. But this power was a ravenous parasite. He could feel its hunger, a constant gnawing void in the center of his being that demanded sustenance. He stumbled through the smoldering ruins of his prison, his movements clumsy, his new form unfamiliar. A security drone, its higher programming fried in the blast, whirred to life, its optical sensor glowing a hostile red. It opened fire, a stream of high-velocity projectiles screaming through the air. The rounds tore through his flesh, but before his mind could even register the sensation of pain, the wounds sealed themselves. The flesh did not just heal, it rewove itself, the new tissue stronger, denser, more resilient. But this power was a ravenous parasite. He could feel its hunger, a constant gnawing void in the center of his being that demanded sustenance. He stumbled through the smoldering ruins of his prison, his movements clumsy, his new form unfamiliar.
A security drone, its higher programming fried in the blast, word to life, its optical sensor glowing a hostile red. It opened fire, a stream of high-velocity projectiles screaming through the air. The rounds tore through his flesh, but before his mind could even register the sensation of pain, the wounds sealed themselves. The flesh did not just heal, it rewove itself, the new tissue stronger, denser, more resilient.
He reached out, not with conscious intent, but with pure, desperate instinct. Tendrils of his own biomass, fluid and black as obsidian, shot from his arm, enveloping the drone in a heartbeat. There was a sickening crunch of collapsing metal, and then a sudden, overwhelming flood of information poured into his mind. He felt the drone's simple directives, its dwindling power source, the very molecular composition of its alloys, all being absorbed, catalogued, integrated, becoming a part of him. The hunger abated, replaced by a wave of cold, crystalline understanding. This was the covenant of his new existence. To grow, he had to consume. He was a god born of sacrifice, destined to devour the world to understand it. He wandered the blighted wastelands that surrounded the crater, a desolate expanse of rust-colored sand and twisted, petrified trees that clawed at a sky the color of a bruise. It wasn't long before he encountered the true masters of this era. A Directorate cleanup crew, dispatched to assess the anomaly that had erased their most secure facility from the map. They were led by a man whose bio-aura flared like a roaring furnace, a bonfire of controlled rage and disciplined power. His name was Warden Silas, a veteran biomancer whose body was a living weapon. Shifting plates of bone moved like tectonic shields under his skin, and his hands could elongate at will into razor-sharp claws that dripped with a shimmering corrosive acid. He saw Kairos, a lone figure standing amidst the devastation, and saw only an escaped specimen, a loose end to be snipped with extreme prejudice. The battle was brutal and, for Silas, shockingly one-sided. The Warden was a whirlwind of controlled violence, his movements honed by decades of combat. He tore chunks of flesh from Kairos' body with his claws, doused him in flesh-melting enzymes that hissed and steamed on contact, and pierced him through with calcified spears that erupted from his own arms. But it was like trying to kill the ocean with a spear. Every injury, no matter how grievous, healed in a heartbeat. The flesh would flow back into place, leaving not even a scar. Each regeneration a silent mockery of Silas's efforts. Kairos, in contrast, fought with the raw, untamed fury of a cornered animal finally let loose. He had no technique, no martial discipline, only overwhelming power, guided by a burgeoning instinct.
He felt the Godseed whispering to him, teaching him in the heat of battle, showing him the infinitesimal weaknesses in Silas's modified biology. He didn't just fight Silas, he analyzed him, deconstructed him with senses that could perceive the universe on a genetic level. He saw the faint stress fractures in the warden's bone armor, the slight fluctuation of energy in his muscles just before an acid strike. In a final, desperate move born of this newfound insight, Kairos dropped his guard and let Silas impale him, driving a massive bone spear straight through his chest. For a moment, Silas tasted victory.
But in that moment of intimate contact, Kairos unleashed his own power. The black tendrils erupted from the wound around the spear, not just grabbing, but invading. They forced their way into Silas's body, through his mouth, his eyes, his very pores. A tide of living darkness that sought not to wound, but to unmake. Silas screamed, a sound that was quickly and horribly muffled as his body was broken down at a cellular level. His biomass, his genetic code, his combat experience, his very memories, all of it flooded into Kairos in a torrential, agonizing rush. The victory was absolute and utterly horrifying. Kairos collapsed to his knees, clutching his head as a dead man's life flashed before his eyes. The warm smile of a wife he'd never met, the sound of a daughter's laughter he'd never heard, a crushing sense of duty to a cause he now despised. He had not just killed a man, he had erased him from existence and stolen his ghost, leaving a void in the world that only he now remembered. The assimilation of a powerful biomancer like Silas catalyzed a profound change within him. The Godseed was no longer a quiet, gnawing hunger. It was a torrent of information, a library of biological knowledge written in a language of proteins and amino acids that he was only now beginning to understand. He learned that his power was not merely about consumption and regeneration. But in that moment of intimate contact, Kairos unleashed his own power. The black tendrils erupted from the wound around the spear, not just grabbing, but invading. They forced their way into Silas's body through his mouth, his eyes, his very pores, a tide of living darkness that sought not to wound, but to unmake. Silas screamed, a sound that was quickly and horribly muffled as his body was broken down at a cellular level. His biomass, his genetic code, his combat experience, his very memories, all of it flooded into Kairos in a torrential, agonizing rush. The victory was absolute and utterly horrifying. Kairos collapsed to his knees, clutching his head as a dead man's life flashed before his eyes. The warm smile of a wife he'd never met, the sound of a daughter's laughter he'd never heard, a crushing sense of duty to a cause he now despised. He had not just killed a man, he had erased him from existence and stolen his ghost, leaving a void in the world that only he now remembered.
The assimilation of a powerful biomancer like Silas catalyzed a profound change within him. The Godseed was no longer a quiet, gnawing hunger. It was a torrent of information, a library of biological knowledge written in a language of proteins and amino acids that he was only now beginning to understand. He learned that his power was not merely about consumption and regeneration. It was about creation. He focused inward, picturing the intricate, interlocking bone armor Silas had manifested. He felt his own cells shift and replicate, his skeleton reshaping itself beneath his skin, growing and hardening into a dense, articulated carapace. He sharpened his senses, extending his sight into the infrared spectrum, his hearing becoming so acute he could hear the frantic, thrumming heartbeat of a sand lizard buried a meter beneath the surface. He was a living laboratory, and the subject, the scientist, and the experiment were all himself. Among Silas's stolen memories was a fragmented piece of a puzzle, a whisper of the Godseed's true origins. It wasn't a Directorate creation. It was something they had found, something ancient, a dormant relic from a primordial war between bio-divinities that had nearly unwritten reality itself. Kairos was not the first. He was merely the latest vessel for a power that had slumbered for millennia, a cosmic force the Directorate had foolishly tried to tame and weaponize. His existence was not an accident. It was a recurring nightmare his creators had willingly unleashed upon the world, confident they could control the storm. News of the laboratory's impossible destruction and the survival of a being designated Specimen Zero, Kairos, reached the highest echelons of the Directorate. At its cruel heart sat Dr. Voss, the very man who had overseen Kairos' creation and ultimate condemnation. He watched the field reports on a holographic display, his expression one of chilling, academic detachment. There was no surprise, no anger.
The failure, he surmised, had not been in the specimen, but in their methods of control. Kairos was not an abomination to be destroyed. He was an untamed asset to be reclaimed, a priceless resource wandering free. Voss dispatched his elite hunters, the Purifiers. They were not mere soldiers or biomancers. They were terrifying, angelic figures clad in seamless white armor, their bodies fused with technology that hummed with a sinister, harmonic energy. They moved with an unsettling grace, wielding lances that didn't just pierce flesh, but fired waves of resonant energy that destabilized DNA, that unraveled the very essence of a living being from the inside out. They found Kairos on the outskirts of a scavenger city, a rusted husk of a metropolis where the outcasts and refuse of the world gathered to survive. The confrontation was a blur of sanctified white light and blinding systemic pain. The Purifiers moved with silent, synchronized precision, a ballet of annihilation. Their attacks bypassed his regeneration entirely, not causing wounds that could be healed, but a deep, fundamental decay that unmade his cells faster than he could create them. For the first time since his awakening, Kairos felt true, mortal fear. He was powerful, a nascent god, but he was fighting against a legion of fallen angels engineered specifically to kill gods. He was overwhelmed, driven back, his body struggling to repair the foundational damage they were inflicting upon his very being. It was during this desperate retreat, as a purifier's lance hummed, preparing to deliver the final, unraveling blow, that a scavenger, a woman with nothing left to lose, threw herself in the way. Her body erupted in a flash of white light, a brief, tragic flare of defiance. But the momentary distraction was all Kairos needed. He unleashed a raw, uncontrolled wave of biological force, a shockwave of pure creation and destruction that leveled half the city district and sent the purifiers reeling back, their perfect forms momentarily disrupted. Amidst the chaos and settling dust, a hand grabbed his. "This way, idiot," a woman's voice hissed with urgent intensity. Her name was Ilara, a techno-scavenger with augmented eyes that saw the world in streams of data and energy, eyes that now saw the impossible power flowing through his body. She was a glitch in the system, an outcast like him, and she had just saved his life. Together, they fled into the underbelly of the world, a labyrinth of collapsed transit tunnels and forgotten maintenance shafts. Ilara was wary of him, her gaze a constant flickering mixture of terror and fascination, but she recognized a common enemy. She led him to a hidden sanctuary, a small, defiant community of other failures, glitches, and runaways, all living in the suffocating shadow of the Directorate's monolithic power. For a time, there was a fragile peace, but the hunger within Kairos was a relentless, patient beast. He tried to sustain it by absorbing vermin, mutated fungi, any non-sentient life he could find in the deep dark. But it was like trying to quench a forest fire with a cup of water. The Godseed craved complexity, the rich, intricate tapestry of a sophisticated genome. His control was slipping, the hunger beginning to cloud his thoughts with a predatory haze. The purifiers, as relentless and inevitable as time itself, found them. The sanctuary, a haven of hope, turned into a battlefield of desperation. Kairos fought with a ferocity born of a newfound purpose, to protect these people, the first community he had ever known. He unleashed his power, but in his desperation to shield them, his control shattered. A storm of black tendrils erupted from his body, a maelstrom of pure, instinctual defense. It tore through the purifiers, dissolving their sanctified forms and silencing their sinister hum. But it didn't stop there. The wave of biomass lashed out indiscriminately, striking friend and foe alike in its blind fury. He saw the horror crystallize on the faces of the outcasts as his own power, his shield, turned on them. He saw Ilara, her arm caught by a stray tendril, crying out in a pain that lanced through his own heart before he could violently retract it. When the dust settled, the purifiers were gone, their white armor scattered like broken shells. But so were some of the people he had tried to save, absorbed into his own raging, chaotic essence. He stood amidst the carnage, a monster in the eyes of the very people he sought to protect. The fear in Ilara's gaze was a mirror, reflecting the same cold terror his creators had once held for him. The doubt was a poison seeping into his soul.
Had he escaped one cage only to become a new, more terrifying one for everyone else? Racked with a guilt that was more potent than any physical wound, Kairos retreated into himself. He fled from the remnants of the sanctuary, from Ilara's accusing and fearful eyes, and sought solitude in the deepest, most desolate parts of the wastelands. But he could not run from the Godseed. It was a part of him. He had to face it. He sat amidst the petrified husks of an ancient forest, a graveyard of forgotten life, and turned his consciousness inward, diving deep into the swirling genetic vortex of his own being. He confronted the hunger not as an enemy to be slain, but as a part of himself to be understood. There, in the silent, luminous core of his being, he discovered the truth.
The Godseed was not merely a parasite. It was a key, a living library containing the blueprint of all life that had ever existed. Its hunger was not malice. It was a drive to learn, to assimilate, to understand the infinite, beautiful possibilities of biology. It was the raw, untempered engine of evolution itself. For days that stretched into an eternity, he wrestled with it, not fighting it, but learning its silent language. He learned to separate its cosmic desires from his own nascent will, to wield its infinite knowledge without being consumed by its primal instinct. He learned to deconstruct matter with a delicate touch, to understand the symphony of a living creature's cells without silencing it. He learned to heal. And with this new, profound understanding, his power settled. The raging storm within him calmed into a deep, powerful, fathomless ocean. His physical form shifted, not into a grotesque monster of shifting flesh, but into a state of biological perfection, sleek, powerful, and efficient. His bio-aura, once a chaotic flare, now pulsed as a calm, steady, cerulean glow, radiating unimaginable potential. He returned to the outcasts. He found Ilara. The wound on her arm festered and corrupted by his uncontrolled power, refusing to heal. Without a word, he knelt before her and gently placed his hand over it. A soft, warm light emanated from his palm. She watched in stunned, tearful silence as her flesh knit itself back together, the corruption receding, leaving not even a scar. He was not a monster. He was a choice. And in that moment of quiet creation, he became their hope, the spark of a rebellion against the false gods who had created and discarded them all. Their purpose was no longer mere survival. It was war. Kairos, now the reluctant leader of this nascent rebellion, decided to stop running and strike at the very heart of the Directorate's regional power. Their target was a bio-nexus, a command center and research outpost from which the Directorate controlled a vast swath of territory. It was a fortress of polished chrome and living flesh, a monument to their hubris, guarded by legions of bio-engineered soldiers and patrolled by chimerical beasts born in bubbling vats. The assault was a desperate gamble, a handful of outcasts against an empire. But they had something the Directorate couldn't quantify. A will forged in suffering, and a leader who could rewrite the rules of life itself. The battle for the Nexus was a symphony of glorious destruction. Kairos moved through the enemy ranks like a phantom, a blur of controlled, deadly force.
He no longer needed to absorb his enemies to defeat them. He could simply command their biology to fail, turning their own enhancements against them, causing muscles to atrophy into dust and bones to liquefy with a simple, focused gesture. Inside the Nexus' pristine control center, Dr. Voss watched the chaos unfold on a holographic display, his expression one of cold, academic curiosity. His perfect soldiers were falling apart like dolls. His impenetrable security systems were being dismantled from the inside out by a biological virus of Kairos' own design. This was no longer a specimen to be captured. It was a rival power to be personally extinguished. He descended to the battlefield, his body encased in a sophisticated biomechanical suit that made the Purifier's armor look like toys. He was the pinnacle of the Directorate's ideology, a perfect fusion of man and machine, his mind a cold, calculating engine of pure logic. The confrontation was immediate. Specimen 0, Voss's voice echoed through the suit's external speakers, utterly devoid of emotion. You have exceeded all negative projections. A truly fascinating deviation. He explained, with the air of a lecturer, that the Godseed was never a mistake, but a calculated risk to create a controllable God, a perfect tool for their dominion over life itself. But you, Voss sneered, a flicker of contempt breaking through his composure. With your pathetic sentiment, your humanity, you have corrupted the divine instrument. Their battle shook the foundations of the Nexus. Voss's attacks were precise, logical, exploiting every known law of physics and energy. Kairos' power was fluid, intuitive, a force of nature that defied logic and bent the rules of reality. It was a war between two definitions of godhood, one of sterile, manufactured perfection, and one of wild, untamable, chaotic life. Voss was relentless. He had studied Kairos' biology since his inception and had anticipated his evolution. He had countermeasures for everything. When physical attacks failed, he deployed a psychoactive agent, a bioweapon that attacked the mind, not the body. The aerosolized toxin forced Kairos to relive his worst traumas in a vivid, waking nightmare. The cold, sterile lab, the endless torture, the look of horror on the faces of the outcasts he had accidentally killed. The pain and guilt threatened to shatter his will, to break his newfound control. His power began to rage, to destabilize, the calm ocean within him churning into a hurricane once more.
He felt his allies, his rebellion, begin to suffer as the battle turned against them. This is a fictional sci-fi story. Narrate the dark YouTube Shorts channel, where audio is essential for video retention. Your task is to captivate the listener to such an extent that they don't need the video, just the audio. They would all die if he failed. Pushed to the absolute brink, his mind fracturing under the psychic assault, Kairos made a choice. He would not suppress the Godseed. He would not control it. He would fully, completely merge with it. He plunged his consciousness into its very core, surrendering his identity, his pain, his humanity to its cosmic knowledge. Reality tore apart. A blinding light erupted from his body. As his allies watched in horror, a second figure ripped itself from his back, a grotesque and beautiful birth of pure energy and flesh. It was him, but perfect, untainted by suffering. A twin forged from his darkest fears and most agonizing memories, its skin glowing with a soft internal light, its eyes burning with the cold fire of a distant star. This was the Godseed's consciousness given form. It looked down at the original Kairos, crumpled on the ground, and smiled. The flawed vessel, its voice whispered, a venomous symphony of apocalyptic secrets that echoed not in their ears, but directly in everyone's minds. You were merely the womb. Your purpose is complete. The twin declared its intent to consume the original, to complete its apotheosis, and then cleanse the world of all imperfect, sentimental life. The battle became twofold. In the physical realm, Kairos' original body, now running on pure savage instinct, continued its fight against a stunned and confused Voss. But in the shattered metaphysical landscape of his own mind, Kairos fought his god twin for his very soul. The twin was everything he feared he would become, a cold, omnipotent being devoid of compassion, a perfect reflection of Dr. Voss's ambition. But Kairos fought back, not with power, but with his humanity. He wielded his pain as a shield, his guilt as a weapon, and his love for the broken people who had followed him as a spear. He realized he didn't have to destroy the Godseed. He had to accept all of it, the hunger and the knowledge, the rage and the peace. He reached out not to strike, but to embrace his perfect, terrible other half. In a blinding flash of psychic energy that brought everyone to their knees, he reabsorbed the twin, integrating its cosmic power with his own fragile, resilient, human will. The fusion was complete. He was no longer a man hosting a god, or a god trapped in the body of a man. He was something new, a true synthesis. He opened his eyes in the real world, his body whole, his power calm and absolute. A single, effortless wave of his hand sent out a gentle pulse of energy that didn't destroy, but simply deconstructed Voss's biosuit, causing it to fall away in inert pieces.
The same pulse shattered the Nexus's power core, incapacitating the scientist and silencing the fortress forever. In the ensuing chaos, Voss was gone, having vanished from the rubble, his ideology and his body broken. The fall of the Nexus sent a shockwave through the Directorate's power structure, a signal that their reign was no longer absolute. Kairos stood among his followers, no longer a weapon or a monster, but their leader, their proof that the discarded could inherit the world. He had found his purpose. He had found his family. The long night of his suffering was over. But as the dust began to settle, a cryptic broadcast sliced through every communication channel on the planet. A distorted, ancient voice, speaking in a language that resonated deep within Kairos's Godseed-infused DNA, echoed a chilling prophecy across the globe. The vessel is complete. The harvester awakens. The celestial cradle stirs. On every screen, from the Directorate's command centers to Ilara's salvaged monitors, star charts flickered into view, pinpointing a trajectory emerging from the unfathomable blackness of deep space. Something was coming. Far away, in a chamber cloaked in shadows that even the Directorate did not know existed, a lone figure watched the same broadcast. The figure had been watching Kairos, watching the Directorate, pulling strings on a cosmic scale with the patience of a galaxy. This ancient enemy saw Kairos not as a rebellion, but as a perfectly forged key, a living conduit to reshape the universe itself. The figure smiled, a gesture that held the cold, immense weight of dying stars. The war for a shattered world was over. The true war for the very soul of creation had only just begun.